Greetings and welcome to this wee chat about my latest exhibition, DistoMorph. It's very different to my previous exhibition, which was my first big solo exhibition, which was called Algorithms. It was based on a residency I spent down on King Island, and I created a very very mimetic style. I kind of was trying to reproduce the beautiful photos I'd taken, and somewhere along the journey I realized that there was no real point in doing that. So this came from the same sort of starting point. I'm always really inspired by nature, but this time I allowed more of an interpretive thing to come into it. I didn't feel the need to reproduce what I saw in nature. I wanted to show how it made me feel, the kinds of worlds it made me imagine, just get that more abstracted kind of process, which I'd started to get towards the end of making algorithms. So this became a lot of fun, and it became very brightly coloured. It started off really quite muted, but it just grew into a wonderful celebration of colour, of nature, of line and texture, and everything. And I love that. I hope you do too. This was one of the first pieces I created, and as you can see, it's in a very muted palette of black and white and silver. It was based on a mineral sand rivulet pattern I saw on the beach on King Island, and I thought it would make a wonderful piece. So I created the shape of the rivulet that I wanted to sew onto polyester organza by painting a mix of acrylic paint and artist gel medium to delineate the shape, because once you're actually sewing on the fabric, you really don't know where you're going. So that gave me a guide, and I could also stitch into it because it's quite a soft and rubbery texture. And then I made cords. I cut strips of fabric, stretch fabric, and zigzagged over them to make these cords. Some of them I included a little bit of sparkly crochet thread for a nice little glint. And then I got all these cords and machine stitched them onto the organza following the guide. So this is done with free motion embroidery with just this little, I'll put my little laser pointer on, with just this little darning foot on, and the presser foot controls are off, which means I can move my fabric around. I've got control of it, not the machine. And of course, as you can see, it was very helpful to have that guide to follow. You can see in the middle there, I've got the two different colorways coming together on the organza. And then when I was finishing it off, I did some just hand stitch some little sparkly beads on. And then when the piece was finished being stitched onto the organza, I just simply burn it out with a soldering iron. And that creates just a nice little sealed edge. And then I made a little wire armature and stitched that behind to give it some solidity, and so I could do a little bit of shaping with it. This is another one of the earliest works. I actually did sort of two versions of this. In the middle here you can see this is my second armature I made. My first was very clunky and didn't work, so sometimes you've just got to unpick things and start again. A lot of work had gone into it. So I made this definitely more stable, but still very expressive piece, because in the exhibition it's been in many formats. It can hang, it can sit, it can go on the wall, can do all sorts of things. So it was inspired by this image I've taken of like a sea lettuce. And what I've done with a lot of my photos is I've just extracted the element that I'm really interested in. So again, that's helping with abstracting it in some way, whereas previously I was looking at the whole image and wanting to do something with all of that, where here I've just got it down to one element that I want to play with. And what I've done with a lot of these is I've put them into the computer and just done some very simple color plays with them and come up with these really odd, almost like negative versions of images, which gave me a fun place to start with. The first material I started using with this piece was copper shim, which I had left over from an experimental piece I've made for algorithms. I'd found that you can beautifully colour the copper with a little flame torch, and that created these lovely ring patterns, which reminded me of that sort of bracket fungi look, which I could see in that sea lettuce image from the previous slide. To contain these little copper shapes I'd cut out, I made these little shibori shapes in polyester organza. So I've used as the resists either casino chips, or I think I actually used foam core from Signs and just cut that, and then I steam the polyester organza with these shapes tied firmly in, and then leave them to dry, and they set in that shape. The purple organza shibori shapes over the copper looked absolutely beautiful with the flame painting underneath. It has tarnished a little. I didn't seal it, but it's still looking pretty good. And then to fill in the spaces with a nice textural fabric between these beautiful shibori shapes, I created basically my own fabric. So got a lot of scraps, a lot of them of heat distressed fabric with a heat gun, and then I kind of just tear it apart, particularly when it's a lace. They really rip apart nicely with lovely strands, and then I put them in an embroidery hoop, and then sew all the little pieces on with the free motion embroidery, and that creates this wonderful texture, which I then cut up and hand sewed onto this structural piece to create the whole thing. Another early piece, again, very much influenced by algorithms. In that exhibition, I found that if I boiled this upholstery leather I had, it sort of curled itself around very naturally and became quite firm, almost like dried kelp, and created some quite lovely natural curves, as you can see here. So I made this little kind of like a wreath of dried kelp. And then when the colour palette of DistoMorph changed, I photographed the work and I used it in the computer, did that bit of a colour change thing with it, and came up with this. That's almost exactly how it looked in the program. And so I simply took forever to paint it with acrylics, because there's a lot to cover, particularly on the back surface of the leather, which is not sealed and it's furry and it takes a lot of paint. I spoke before about creating a pattern on the fabric that I could follow when I'm sewing on the machine, and I thought lino printing would be another great way of doing this. And also I just love lino cutting, the whole process I love. So I used this design in the middle here, which came from a workshop I did with Alison Michelo-Marsden a year or so ago, where we were using different items to a monoprint with, and I'd got some of my heat treated fabric, which was all bubbly and lovely, and put that into the ink and printed that, and it came up with this gorgeous pattern which looks just like lichen to me. So I used that for one of my big print here on the right, and then these little ones on the left, I wanted to make a series of smaller patterns to use. I just got some of my images, probably, I think, yes, from my Police Point residency, my one after King Island. So I used those images to create those patterns and cut those out of lino. Something I love about the work that I do is I think so many parts of the process look absolutely gorgeous. So I've got lots of photos of things like this here on the right, my actual lino blocks all linked up. I think they just look gorgeous. So I printed them a lot of things. On the left here, I've printed them on some beautiful ice-dyed rayon, which were garments until the silverfish got to them. And here in the middle, just on some organza, and I've just free motioned into those. So where you can hardly see the printed pattern at all, but you're using it to create this wonderful stitch. In another one you probably got a bit later on, you can see I've used a different colour thread in the bobbin, which can create, particularly on the organza, a really nice mix of colour on the top surface. There we are, two different threads. We've got looks like the pinky one on the bottom, purple on the top. Very subtle on that one. And then I played with printing on different fabrics and using different paints and different thicknesses because I'm not actually using like an ink that you normally would, more of a sticky ink for lino printing, I'm just using acrylic paint. So I'm just having a play with what I can get away with there. This is some more playing. In the middle you can see I've started to layer the organza over the rayon that I've got the printed lino on and stitching into that. Not quite sure why I came up with that. I think I just wanted to mute down the ice-dyed colours a little bit, have it a little bit more homogeneous. And as you can see, that turned into one of the works there on the right, which I combined with these felted, well, they're felt, industrial felt shapes that I've made by simply using the heat gun to melt away a shape that, again, it was another serendipitous discovery when I was playing with something and it melted down into the shape and I went, oh my goodness, that looks just like lichen. So I really enjoyed working with those. Stitching into them can be a little bit tricky because if they melt too much, it becomes very hard, and that's a great way to break needles. This was the beginnings of my piece for Paper on Skin, Xanthoparmelia, which was a wearable art piece. It's got to be made in paper, but I wanted to make sure that it would also fit within the exhibition because, you know, time was of the essence here. I was concentrating on the exhibition, and any time I spent working, I wanted it to be part of that. So I was using my lichen lino print designs, and I printed them in a multitude of colours on meters and meters of this paper ribbon, which I'd spray painted for a base colour. Then I stitched along one edge so I could gather them up and shape them into little cup shapes to make that sort of lichen shape before finishing them up on the top edge with paper twine, which also gave them a pop of colour as well as some stability. Making sure I go over that end edge nicely and using my special little pokey tool, which is so handy. Here is the finished work, Xanthoparmelia, which has a headpiece, bodice and skirt which join in a few tricky ways, and the groovy little boots there. Here's the little cup shape, so just made heaps and heaps of these in all different sizes. And here on the right is the paper print. This is a particularly nice bit, and I've also done a little bit of gilding over there. So I've ironed on a piece of Bonder web, which is sort of half spent, so it's only got these little bits to it, and then put the foil on. So you just get this really, really patchy, very light effect. By the end of it, I was running out of the printed paper. I'd done a lot of it and I wasn't doing any more. I was down to a few sort of off-cut strips. So like when I was making the fabric cords, I zigzagged over those to give them some strength. I ended up bunching them together in this sort of little zigzaggy twine, just little pieces close together, which made a pretty nice little finish for my little paper frill on my shoes. And here in the middle you can see it in the studio in the process of being put together. Because it was paper, I didn't want to be pinning it all the time because that would risk tearing it and making lots of holes. So I used plastic pegs quite a bit to keep things together, which worked nicely. And on my foam head, just stuck pins in there. Here we have one of my favourite discoveries during this period, the punch needle embroidery, which I'm sure a lot of you are more than well aware of. I guess I'd heard of it. I probably didn't really take it seriously. I don't know how I rediscovered it, but because I love texture, I loved this sort of pile that you could create with this. I think I'd looked at this pile in other applications and wondered how they made it. And this was one way, and you can either keep the loops as we've got on the left here, or they're the loops in close up in the middle, or you can cut the tips off the loops and have this lovely little fuzzy pile. So that was one of my favourite discoveries. So for this work, I've ice-dyed some silk organza, and to mark my places where I want to put the punch needle embroidery, I've just painted on with acrylic paint just some little basic shapes to show me where to follow, because in the samples I'd done, I had tried following some of my lino prints, but the the outline was so vague, you couldn't really get any of that detail. It was all wasted, so it might as well just be a fairly basic shape to go around. So I just used that. In the middle, you can see where I've cut the pieces out and wanted to layer it up to create a little more depth, a bit more colour interest, a bit of sparkle, of course. So in the middle is a tulle with a bit of a rainbow print, metallic print across it. And on the bottom is this wonderful mesh material I got down in Melbourne, which is this beautiful gold on one side and silver on the other. I only got a couple of meters and I've had it there for ages, and this was its time. So here you can see the looped stitches. I haven't cut them down yet. And here in the top right is the reverse. And this you have to glue to make sure it stays, because as you can imagine, it's just looped through the fabric. If you pull it, it's just going to all unwind. So you need to secure it at the back. I think normally they make sort of rugs and hard wearing things out of these, so it's a bit different with these finer fabrics. And obviously I didn't want to make it chunky and horrible, so I found a nice clear craft glue, which was yeah, it seemed to do the job, kept everything there. Another exciting technique I got to play with for this exhibition was plastics, using plastic soda bottles. I'd done a bit before many years ago. I made a couple of pieces for the World of Wearable Art in this technique. I got to play with it a little bit more at the end of last year when I had a little mini residency up at Gattaca's Art Space in Maryborough. So it was great to play with that again. And this one in the middle here is done simply with the heat gun, which just melted into all sorts of shapes. You can stop and kind of bend it where you want it to go a little bit, but of course you've got to be careful of burning yourself. I did discover too that, I don't know if you can see in the middle here, these sort of opaque bits, they come from using the little flame torch, and that doesn't distort them as much, but seems to add this opaque quality. Here on the right, you just cut little strips, we'll just make little cuts in your piece of plastic, and as you hit it with the heat gun, it's really quite fun. It just goes everywhere. It goes this way, that way, so you kind of got to stop when it's where you want. And over here is where I start assembling the piece from all these kind of shapes. Try to imagine what kind of sculptural piece I can make for the wall with it, and I've just used for the base some pieces of foam I've got from Reverse Garbage. Then I was looking at all different ways I could colour it. It would be nice to keep the transparency of these plastics, but it can be a bit tricky because there's not that much that works on them. I tried polyester dye, which means you need to heat it, which again distorts it a little bit. Also, it's a bit limiting as far as placement goes. You have to have it in a pot submerged. You can see a little bit of blue here. I've done a little sort of wash of blue metallic paint over it. In the middle here, you can see that opaque bit I was talking about, where I've hit it with the flame torch to create that different texture. And then on the right here is where I've created patterns, again inspired by lichen and all sorts of things. I did lots of drawings of patterns on my Police Point residency, and I've used the soldering iron to sort of engrave or etch those designs in. So it's quite a time-consuming process, and also a little stinky. And yes, I do it in the open, nice and airy. So in trying to overcome the issues of colouring the plastic yet trying to keep some of that lovely transparency, I have started playing, and this is by no means resolved, with the fluid acrylic paints. So on the left here you can see I've got that lovely mix, and also a tiny little bit of that sort of cell quality that they make. So that's something I've really got to practice a lot with. In the middle here you can see I've got an engraved shape, and there's a tiny bit you can probably see there is a little bit of alcohol ink that stays on them really nicely, and one of the pieces in the exhibition has that. And on the right here I've tried just rubbing a little bit of acrylic paint over the etching to see if that kind of takes. Yeah, So another technique here with the plastic is sewing some fabric onto the plastic, which you can do. Put the fabric underneath the plastic when you're sewing on the machine, just to protect it, put noising. And then once you've stitched a pattern onto it, you hit it with the heat gun on the plastic, so the plastic shrinks up, brings the fabric with it, and creates this wonderful shade effect, which was really effective with this beautiful rainbow metallic material. I also hit this gorgeous fabric without the plastic attached to it. On the left here you can see it's gone into a really lovely sort of bubbly texture. In some places it was almost like skin, and it also depends on which way you hit it with the heat gun. So if you hit it from the wrong side, your bubbles will come out that way, but if you hit it on the good side, it bubbles convexly. Here we have more playing with colouring the plastic. I started off with a base layer on this cream one, but I hadn't thought about how as the pieces curl around you will see that base layer because it's transparent. Also on this one on the left here you can see a little bit of sort of stitch marks. It's where I've tried to stitch it together with the soldering iron, just doing little melty stitches. That it did work to some extent, but I wasn't happy with its level of security. So as you can see on these ones here, I've also put a little, like a rivet through their paper fasteners. They just have the two wings that you push out to hold it underneath. And of course I wanted to disguise those a bit. So over here I started using my little dimensional paints just to kind of pattern over them and help blend them in. And it also created, it was a nice opportunity for creating a little bit of contrast. I do love reusing things, and here I was so happy to find this wire armature already covered in satin for me, and it was just a gorgeous shape. So that was a wonderful find, and I used it to make a piece that I already had in mind, so it was a happy little marriage. So I ended up putting these beautifully contrasting fabrics together. I've just spray glued the two fabrics together, cut them out, and then stitched around them here with zigzag stitch with a free motion embroidery with a piece of yarn around it to create that colour contrast. Again, I'm looking for beautiful colours and textures to help fill the spaces between these elements. So here I've got some heat distorted organza, which creates these beautiful bubbles, which are just so organic, I think. Same thing here. This is some painted Gonda web ironed onto some material with some foil applied as well. And I think this one, I should not point with my finger, use my laser. This one was over a lichen lino print as well. You can just sort of vaguely see an outline of that. That was just a sample piece, I think, but this is just trying to get all these different levels of delicious texture that I can build on and sew into. So here on the left is another of my basic design pieces where I've taken the imagery that I'm interested in out of the photo and just kept that. I thought this would make a lovely, lovely shape on the wall. So in order to facilitate that, I am over here felting over a wire armature I've made. This was a similar piece. This one was made with a felt base and a few different fabrics on the background. It really went through a lot of changes, which a lot of things did, as quite often the original ideas or the original fabric I've chosen doesn't actually do what I want it to do. So then I just continue to modify until I get what I want. So originally these ones were, I'm using my ironing board to pin it onto. I've run out of boards at this stage, run out of room everywhere. And again, I've gone around them with a contrast yarn, zigzagged around it. And so this was like a Nuno felted piece, and that was going to be the feature side, but I wasn't loving it. So I ended up having that as the back and layering quite a few fabrics on the other side to create this, and these are then pinned out, ready to hand sew onto my felted armature. This is the beginnings of probably one of my favourite pieces from the exhibition. It's continued to grow so much from its conception, and now even as it's exhibiting, it keeps changing each time. But my initial imagery here was a photo taken of a rotting wallaby on King Island. This was on my second visit when I returned to open my exhibition Algorithms down there. And so, as usual, I've taken the piece of the imagery that I'm really interested in out in a photo managing program, and I've played with it. I've put it together, multiplied it, different sizes, played with colours, and I've come up with this kind of design. Sometimes I still get a bit nitpicky about following these designs a little bit too closely. I've made this cardboard template here where, as you can see, it's got pieces weaving in and out of each other, which when I went to go and make it with a wire armature was quite tricky, and then I had to do another 3. I loved this work when it was all pinned together in white. It would have been very nice to keep it that way. Maybe one day I'll work in white, but it's me. I've got to colour. So, I mean, really it would have been better if I'd used coloured wool to start with. It was much harder to dye this kind of thing. But I had a crack. I've had a few goes at this. This in the middle is probably one of the, that looks like the first one, where it came out really a very soft pink. I did manage to re-dye it, I think twice before the exhibition, and also ended up hand stitching these yarns on the edges of them. Initially I had them needle felted in, but because it was an acrylic yarn, it wasn't really taking, so I had to go around and stitch them all in. These are some little shibori shapes I've made using little plastic button counter things. I would have got those in a little bag from Reverse Garbage. As I said before, I use casino chips when I'm doing round. I use marbles. I've used foam core. Anything metal, plastic that can withstand the heat of steaming. And then over here on the right, I'm experimenting with how I can further decorate them. I've done this little bit of paint rub over the top. Here I've got a little bit of machine stitching in, and then playing with my little dimensional paint with my dots. And these were to go in with these beautiful felt pieces. I think I had about 7 of these left over. I'd made them for one of my first exhibitions, Morphology, many years ago, and they never got used in a piece, and I never throw anything out. And during this exhibition, I must have been digging through a box and found them, and I thought, I think this could be their time. Here's that sort of industrial polyester felt I was talking about here in the white, where I've just burnt out shapes with the heat gun, and I think they look absolutely gorgeous. Again, gorgeous white, could leave them. Here's some of my painted experiments. Another one over here. That colorway just wasn't working for me. And then I got this bunch of gorgeous colors, which I was very happy with. It's unusual for me to put this bright green in, but it's been really fun playing with colours I'm not always so comfortable with. So these are the felt pieces, all made separately. Then I've stitched them onto an organza that I've printed on. I've used the lino print, I think, done a bit of stitching into a bit of splatter painting and some metallic paint there, I think. So stitched them all down in the shape that I've wanted them to be. And then in between spaces, I've hooped it up and done my punch needle embroidery to create that sort of textural effect of them going into each other more in a more natural sort of growth pattern. Welcome back to part 2 of this discussion about the works I created for my exhibition DistoMorph. This image is one I pretty much had in mind from the start, based on the beautiful lichen growths I saw on the garage down at my abode in Police Point on my residency down there. So again, I've played with the image in Photoshop, just played with the levels and curves, that kind of thing, and created some different colorways. To create that on silk, I wanted to use ice dye, which is where you get your fabric ready, sprinkle ice cubes on, or if you're lucky enough to live in that kind of environment, your snow, and then you sprinkle your powdered dye over, and as the snow or ice melts, it takes the dye powder with them and makes beautiful organic patterns, and a lot of the dyes split into some really interesting looks. So I did that, and it looks perfect as it is in the bath, but it doesn't actually turn out that perfect. So I was also adding to the colour and texture with sewing a lot of different fragments of fabric, and you can see on the right here I've cut up and torn up a lot of pieces of different colours, different types of fabrics, which I'm then going to free motion embroider onto the surface of my main fabric to create colour, texture and depth. In the end, I don't think I used that fabric that I ice dyed. On the left here you can see some silk that I've pretty much just cram dyed with, I think, an aqua dye as a base to become tubes of fabric to shove onto these PVC tubes here, which I then steam, which sets all those creases into the fabric and creates this beautiful texture here on the right. This one I don't just steam, I also put it in dye as well, and if I only want a dark dye in this area, I'll set it just in that space, but to avoid getting a hard line, I'll make sure I move it around in the pan a bit to integrate that. So that's one of those dye jobs where you're present a lot during it. And then to add the extra colour onto the ripples afterwards, I just brushed on some acrylic paint, because once again I'm not working with wearables anymore and I don't have to worry about laundering things. So here you can see the very involved process of sewing all these pieces of fabric here, all the free motion embroidery around the edge of these shibori shapes onto a base fabric, which had to be nice and firm. So I used some cheap upholstery fabric I bought. Over here you can see a bit of metal fabric. This was from my workshop I did with Alison Midgelow Marsden a year or so ago, where we got to play with all different ways of colouring the metal and practicing stitching with it. I did really want to include it in here, and I still want to do a lot more with that kind of technique, so watch out. This is another very early piece which came from my last visit to King Island when I took my exhibition there. Up here you can see the original image, which was kelp chips left after the kelpers have finished processing the kelp, just cutting bits off and putting it into their trucks. And I just loved the pattern it made. So in the photo, I just alienated the bits of the chips on the ground that I wanted to use, and used that as my base for my shape, which I then created with pieces of felt. I made a big piece of felt, cut it up into these shapes, and played with making that overall shape, and then had to figure out how I was going to actually secure that as a whole to hang on a gallery wall. On the right here you can see I'm looking at adding some texture. I've got some fabric that is used from beard snoods, that very light kind of interfacing that's also in hospital gowns and things, which I've scrunkled up with my heat gun and brushed a little paint on, just a little piece of texture and colour to sew on there, which I've done with the machine, along with some other little fragments of fabric. And then later on over here you can see I've added my customary little bit of bling with some sequin fabrics and some actual sequins and beads. This is yet another piece based on King Island imagery. I found this smashed sea urchin on the rocks, thought it was fabulous. Again, isolated the shape in Photoshop, repeated it, changed the scale, highlighted the colours, changed them, and I loved these really intense blue bits, and it just sort of reminded me of opals and just really scrummy rock formations. Like many pieces in this exhibition, it had a real evolution, starting off with a piece of botanically dyed silk, which I then used acrylic paint to indicate the areas that were going to be that lovely blue, and set them out on my table in the design that was from that computer work. And then I think, because it was on the outside table, I think it got disturbed by the wind and I had to redo it. And then I came up with some other ideas and, started to move away from being restricted to that image that was my original design. And I realized I didn't have to actually stick to that. I've got my idea. It's got me this far. I can now take it where I like. Like the previous piece, this one involved a lot of sewing little scraps of fabric using free motion embroidery. I refer to these little bits and pieces as fabric pizza. That's what I'm making. I'm playing here in the middle, playing with the Solvay dissolvable base fabric, which I've never really liked sewing on. If I have to sew on something that I'm going to get rid of, I generally use organza because it's cheap, it's stable, particularly living in Queensland. If you get damp hands on the Solvay, it starts to dissolve. And I've used all sorts of fabric in here, that purple one in the middle, some hideous fabric that comes out for Halloween. But these are the kind of things that can, torn up and in little fragments, can really add things. Here on the left, we can see the process of using the heat gun to gently create some texture in that felt that I use. It's like a polyester, quite firm felt. I've done a bit of test stitching in the middle there just to see whether it makes a difference to its stability and keeping a particular shape. You can see the edges starting to curl up there a bit. You can got to be a bit careful with that if you don't want that to set in that curled up shape. So you've got to flatten it out, but carefully without burning your hands, of course. So you can see some beautiful organic, very licheny shapes happening there. And then on the right is the sped up version of me securing the back of the punch needle embroidery with this really nice clear craft glue that I found. It's really just a really great bottle for applying, quite a happy job just sitting there, but it does take quite a bit of time. My silk ruffles. These are a bit of a breakout from the King Island source imagery. This was kind of based on paperbark trees, just those beautiful ruffles as they start to fall apart. And I was seeing these every day on my walks and thinking, why can't I do that? I really want to do that. And then I realised I can. It's my exhibition. Everything's still going to hang together because it's all based on nature's images. So it's okay, I can do that. So I started making these. I don't know really how I came up with this idea, using the ever-growing shape, in cutting it all out in different pieces of silk. I've got lots of silk discards from a bridal designer, all the offcuts from making the dresses. They're quite a decent size, but not that you could make any garment with, but perfect for me. So I've done those ruffled shapes. I've realised they needed some kind of firm backing to them, otherwise they would really just become a floppy mess on the wall. So I've sewn them onto some upholstery leather that I was gifted. And then I have arranged them in a shape that I was happy with, and I photographed it, and I've popped that into Photoshop to try and play with the colors a bit, just to, yeah, give me a sense of where I wanted to go rather than actually dyeing them and then going, oh no, I don't like that. It was just a nice little starting point. And it was quite a process to dye them as you see them, because they were all sewn together already. So there was a lot of holding things in pots and hanging them up while they were in there. This is what I mean. So on the left here, we've got just the centerpiece of the frilled piece just hanging in the dye there, with the rest of it kept out. In the middle, we've got the opposite. We've got the outside edges in the dye, and I'm keeping the center bit up. I didn't mind a bit of splashing and a bit of integration, but I was trying to keep them a bit separated. So yeah, that kept me on my toes. This is a work that was also very abstracted from its original inspiration, which was the bottom of the kelp, the big strand of kelp, which is called a holdfast, and that's where it clings onto the rock or whatever surface it's growing from. When they dry out, because the kelpers chop them off and just leave them on the ground, and they dry out there and become these gorgeously textured little pebbles. So I thought that was beautiful. I made all these different sized wire armatures that look like little hanging baskets. I really should have made them a bit more solid, but there you go. And then I was looking at how to, again, not emulate the texture of the holdfast pieces, because I'm not trying to make them look like them, but just be inspired by that. So burning the polyester, like a lining fabric or a satin, created that beautiful texture, and I cut them up into these small little sections to try and get that patination. I also experimented here with sewing little cutout circles of the satin onto an organza first before hitting it with the heat gun and texturing it and seeing if that would work. So I actually ended up just painting big pieces of the satin material. I think I was just using watered down acrylic paints because, again, I don't have to worry about laundering. Then I've textured them with the heat gun. Then I've cut out all these little shapes and arranged them over the basket shapes. I didn't want to cover all of them in that pattern. I wanted to create some that were not completely filled with the shape. And on the right here, you can see I'm starting to play with what other texture I can add to that piece. And in the later stages of that, I realized that I wanted some bling, and I thought these bugle beads would look great, but it was so hard to try and sew with a beading needle through all the layers of fabric over the shape, and just handling that was way too hard. So I thought, well, it's easier if I just use an embroidery frame, stretch out some organza on that, do my beading on there, and then cut out little pieces of that and then attach that to the shapes. In the middle here, you can see this is a kind of a lacy fabric that I've spray painted and painted with acrylics and heat treated, so it just it becomes brittle, and then you can tear it into these, again, beautiful organic shapes. It's kind of looking a bit mossy here, and I'm trying to figure out how I can integrate it into this piece. I was finding it all a bit stark, and this wasn't necessarily working for me in the middle, this groovy lace. So on the right here, you can see I ended up just toning everything down and sort of integrating them with each other a little bit better with this very light black mesh. And then I found the plastic bottles I was working with, cut up into the strips into these sort of little frond pieces, worked really well around the edge as well. So there I am in my lounge room doing my beading. It's always nice to have a nice clean job that you can do in front of the TV when you just want to just plod along for a bit and not get all grubby. This is an assemblage of my photos of lichen, which I've put together in an interesting arrangement, and then started to play with colorways with it. One of the things I really love about lichen is the little sort of cupola shapes that they have quite often in the center, or some of them consist entirely of that. And I thought the tops of the bottles that I'd been cutting off to use just the middle bits, I thought these would look quite good as that. So I cut them out, spray painted them to get a base to them, and then hand painted in acrylic over them. And these were to be attached to the base fabric, which was again the bridal designer satin offcuts and their lace offcuts. These have been great. I've got bags and bags still of the sculptural lace, which is great with the heat gun distortion because it takes out all the netting and you just get left with the cording sort of hanging together. Again, very organic. So I've heat distorted the satin and the lace, sewn them together, painted over them, not just with spray paint, so spray paint base, then acrylics, metallics, and on the right here, even some really nice mica paints to give a nice little sparkle. So as usual, I wanted to build up lots of texture. So onto that textured base, I was making these lace motifs to add. So they started with the guipure lace pieces, which I'd painted in brighter colours, and I've put them on organza in the embroidery hoop, stitched them down, and then started to add other pieces of material in. As you can see here, these little pieces of metallic polyester. This is one of the largest pieces I've ever made, and that was quite a challenge to work with. Luckily at the time I had a lot of space to use. I decided to use my good old trusty felt as the backing because it is quite firm and easy to sew into. I didn't just use new material, I gathered a lot of scraps because I do like to use all my scraps up, which was kind of a nice way of building up the shape, and pinching in little darts here, and had pieces overlapping, and that all added to some texture before putting on the distorted fabric in the middle here, and then on the right here it's sort of about halfway through painting. And here we have getting into the plastic works. So on the left here you'll see the base layout for one of my plastic pieces, and this was initially quite simple because for this one I used the Schweppes plastic bottles because they're very smooth, they don't have any of the ridges in, and they've got a nice conical shape. And so you cut them out, and then if you actually just flip them inside out, they've got this lovely curve to them. Instead of rolling right over, they just sit like in a bowl shape. So I had all those on the table and I was just playing with those, and they just sat really nicely together. So then I looked at trying to find a way to join them together as they were. And you can see in the middle here I've used those little paper fasteners. And then I loved the translucence of them, and so I wanted to keep that, but I also wanted to colour them. So that's when I looked into the colouring and found that you could use alcohol inks on them. As you can see on the right, I've done that. It does take quite a bit of ink, which is also quite expensive, and it's very, very slow at trickling down into the etch design on there. I thought they'd really go down more like watercolors, but they're quite slow. This is a really fun and I think quite joyous piece, largely because of the color and texture. It was inspired by a friend's photo of moss, which I saw on his Facebook page and just went, oh, well, I'll have that, thank you. And again, I wanted to work quite large, but I also didn't want to make one huge piece. So I could see in the moss design here, you can see there's little shapes already. So I just sort of drew into that where I thought those shapes might be. So cut it down into a more manageable thing like that, and used my fabulous felt as a base, my polyester felt, and then created the upper fabric with this. It was like a stretch velour velvety thing, very, very weird bright apricot colour. It was something I wouldn't normally buy, but it was again one of those things that I found just so hideous and bright. I thought, that's amazing, let's use it. And then I've created a lot of colour and texture to go into it. Here you can see that on the right is said hideous fabric, which I've just used some acrylic paint to just give it a bit of variety and have it just not one solid colour. Over here on the left and middle is on the left of where it's wet, that's painted Tyvek material, and when it's dry, hit it with the heat gun and creates this beautiful bubbling texture. I then added lots of other scraps and in contrasting colours as well, and a real range of materials. From on the top right here, you see is a beautiful fine crinkle silk chiffon that I've dyed. Here is some netted sequin trim, which I got at a market, and I've dyed that. This gold coloured piece here was this really sort of 70s curtain, very open weave kind of material, which when heat distorted again like becomes really brittle and just tears apart, and it was just a really useful thing. You'll see it in a lot of these pieces. Here it is under the foot. It can get pretty tricky trying to sew over all this texture. You do get caught up a lot, so you've got to keep on the ball. This was one of the works closer to the end of the process where by this stage I felt like I was just getting the hang of what I wanted to do, and all of a sudden now there were so many things I wanted to make and I just didn't have enough time. This was using these padded shapes here. These are some foam shapes I picked up at Reverse Garbage. I covered them in some lycra fabric I got from there as well. I've got some tubing here, some plastic tubing that we have to try and look at making a joining piece that could be put together on the wall, because I'm always thinking when I'm making things about how am I going to pack this, get it there, always trying to break things down into components for ease of travel and installation. This was using the spiky felt here was actually in one of my first exhibitions, Morphology. I think it was the second one. No, it was the first one. And it was sitting in a box, not doing anything, and a lot of work went into making those gorgeous spikes. So I thought, okay, I can use that. I did wonder if I could use these plastic spikes to work in with it. On the right here, you've got me doing the free motion embroidery using the hoop to stabilize the fabric, which here is 2 layers, some purple polyester organza over the ice-dyed rayon, which has the lino printed pattern on it for me to follow. So here you can see a bit of a midway process where I've got the shapes, I've embroidered the patterns onto them, but I'm not sure how I'm going to back them, whether I need to give them any further stability, like say further layers, or sew some wiring. I think I did sew floristry wire around the edges with these, which is quite fine, but just gives them a nice bit of malleability, a bit of stability. I often lay things out on the floor because by that time that's all the room I've got left, and quite often just look around and pick up different things of different colors and textures and just try them, like would that look good. So it is really a fun sense of play, but it can also be quite frustrating when you can't quite find the thing that speaks to you and says it's right. So there you have it. That's part 1 and part 2 of just some of the processes I've used in making this exhibition. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any further questions, please give me an email. That'd be great. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.